j'attendais un... D'accord. Hello. We've just been told it's time to start this afternoon session. I'm very pleased to host this discussion on inequalities and social cohesion, which is the title of this discussion, with three speakers. Two of them are academics, researchers, and the third one is engaged in policy on the ground, on the field. Let me start by presenting Farida Kalagy to you. She's the General Director of a foundation in Le Caire, the Banati Foundation, and she works, and she's going to talk about a specific experience that she has with street girls in this big city. And I think this will be a good example as well for more general questions that we will raise this afternoon with two researchers that will start to talk. Alice Evans, who's sitting next to me, she's a lecturer at King's College in London, and she's also a researcher with Harvard University. She's been doing a lot of work on inequalities and the dynamics of inequalities. I shall put it this way. We'll see what it means and what kind of results she will present. And Frances Stewart is with us as well. She's a professor at Oxford University, and she's been working for a long time on the question not only of inequalities, but also the impact the inequalities have on social cohesion and society. So maybe it would be more sort of logical to start with the statement, something about the situation on inequalities with you, Alice. What can you say to us about the fact that inequalities are very well known? They are probably more known now than ever in the history of societies. We have plenty of data. We have the knowledge that there are a lot of different kinds of inequalities, that these are huge. How it is that inequalities, despite all this knowledge, still persist?
Oh, that's a tricky question, hey? Right, yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's so much data demonstrating the scale of inequality, and yet still we think, you know, if only we publish the headlines showing how bad it really is. So why do we go along with it? I mean, why do we just let it pass, right? And I think there are four possible explanations. One is we might internalize these ideas. So if we look at employment, if we look at politics, we might see white men at the top of business and politics and infer from that that they're naturally more skilled, naturally more competent. So look up to them as leaders. And so if an indigenous or black woman puts herself forward, we might see that as a risky prospect. So these assumptions about a particular group can reinforce inequalities. And often inequalities are just taken for granted, accepted as the way of doing things. You know, for example, Nancy Postero in her research in Bolivia highlights that indigenous people saw education as a privilege, not as a right. And we see that across the world, how people might just accept inequality as that's just the status quo. So, for example, in Brazil, in Santa Catarina, one of the most unequal areas in terms of land distribution, elites thought that they had worked hard and struggled for their land and they deserved to keep it. And who are these lazy people asking for land redistribution, right? So accepting the status quo is given. So that is about our personal endorsement, what we believe. But there's another thing, another possibility. Sometimes we can be privately critical. I myself might not really like inequalities, but I go along with them because I underestimate public frustration and I'm despondent. So it's possible that all of us could be privately critical of inequalities, yet we don't realize the scale of frustration and anger. So we stay quiet. And I don't want to speak out because I don't want you to reprimand me. So for example, I myself might want to be a female leader, but I might anticipate discrimination, so not put myself forward. So if we're despondent, if we're fearful, if we presume the government won't respond, if we think that the government will be aggressive, not capable, we stay quiet. And this creates a real challenge for us all. It creates a chicken and egg problem. Because if I'm quiet, then you don't realize that I'm frustrated. And if I don't speak out, then we don't realize that collective anger. We only realize that collective anger when people take to the streets, when they demand change. And that's how you get over the chicken and egg problem. And hopefully that motivates the government to sort something.
Well, we go back to the last point, what governments can do. Thank you for this very lively introduction. Francis, maybe you can try to answer the same questions about why inequalities still persist at such level. I mean, it's not just that they persist, it's also that they have increased in many areas recently.
Yes, I certainly do that, but I also want to talk about social cohesion, because I feel that in this conference there's been it's in the title, but not enough people are talking about it. So why do they persist? I agree with what Alice says, but I think that's only one of the factors. A very important factor is that people get trapped in their position. They have very little education, they have poor social contacts, their next generation is in the same situation, and then the top generation, fine, they have good contacts, they have good social position, and then in addition to all that, you have discrimination. So I think there are a lot of very tough reasons, and I think these reasons apply particularly between different groups, particularly if you're of a different group, a different color, a different ethnicity, a different religion. If the poor group is of a different ethnicity or religion from the top group, then your contacts are even more tightly contained within the group, and it's much more difficult to get social mobility. And there's a lot of research showing that. So I think there are very, very profound reasons for persistence of inequality, which have to be addressed by policy. And that's where sort of Alice's points come in, because the policy doesn't happen, possibly because none of us speak up. But we are all speaking up, and the policy is still not happening.
Farida, what is your own take on this first question?
I'll focus more on street children or refugees, specifically in Egypt and what I'm currently seeing in Egypt. So, and I link it more to what was mentioned here. So definitely there's a link to stigma and discrimination. And usually inequality builds on stigma and defining groups. So in my case, usually in Egypt, a lot of people see street girls as disease carriers. During the revolution, they were kind of blamed for causing political instability. A lot of people see them as criminals. So slowly you don't identify yourself with them. You give yourself excuses to accept this inequality or the state they're in. Also relating to accepting the status quo, it is true accepting the status quo, and you always, for example, in Egypt being a developing country, you always have the excuse of because we have economic challenges, because the poverty, there are a lot of excuses. When it's actually not the case, it's really the lack of protective measures that sometimes cause inequality and the lack of political will, and not realizing that this inequality eventually would also turn against you somehow. And it will turn against you through, if it's inequality by discriminating a specific nationality, they do turn against people in the end. Or if it's inequality by discriminating against a specific group, it's also, they turn against you through currently we're seeing a lot of revolutions, we're seeing a lot of demonstrations, and it's a means of saying, I'm here, and you're not seeing me, but there's a lot of inequality that happens against me. And also, just the final thing, in Egypt specifically, you've got a very good child's law, but you've got very poor implementation. So it's also linked to lack of political will that sometimes causes all these inequalities. Thank you.
Maybe we can go back to the situation. Well, I mean, it's really hard to talk generally because situations are very different probably from one place to another. But still there are recurrent things, and I'd like you to explain to us how there can be a great difference between the reality of inequalities, then the possibility of objectifying these realities through data or through knowledge, any kinds of methods from the social sciences, for example, but also from journalism or even sometimes from literature or the arts. And there is a third level, which is how each individual will perceive these inequalities. And sometimes there are big discrepancies between these three levels. So maybe in order to get these kind of policies that are efficient, that you were talking about, one first thing could be to be better aware of how these three levels are connected or disconnected.
Right, yeah, that's a brilliant question. So the argument, your suggestion, as I understand it, is there can be huge inequality, but people may underestimate the degree of inequality in their own country. And if only they were aware of how serious it was, they might push for some kind of policy change. And I think that's true in part. So people tend to hang around with people a bit like them. Like, I spend a lot of time with other academics, and they have a similar income to me, and I might assume that I'm somewhere near the median. And I think that everyone else in my country is a bit like me, and I might not be aware of the full extent of wealth or deprivation. That said, so that's true. That said, even when people are more aware of the relative deprivation and their place in it, even if people know they're at the bottom, they can be still skeptical, fearful their government will do anything. So a colleague of mine does research in India, highlighting that you have poor, rural women who know how deeply poor and oppressed they are, but they're skeptical of the possibility that the government will respond. So they don't even push for services, for accountability. They know they're poor. They're fully aware of that. They've seen the Bollywood films. They see how the other half live. But because they're skeptical, because they don't anticipate a responsive governance, they don't push for change. And then you get trapped in that chicken and egg problem. So the big question is how that can change. And interestingly, in that research in India, they highlight that when people have slightly broader social networks, or when they travel a little bit more, they go to another district and they see a more responsive governance, and they're like, ha! Okay, I'm going to push for that at home too. So I absolutely agree with you that challenging those perceptions are important, but it's not just about understanding the level of inequality, it's about believing that change is possible. Thank you.
Yes, on perceptions, I mean, clearly people act out of what they perceive, not what is their objective situation. So it is a very important and interesting issue. And yet we find that objective inequalities do have a lot of consequences. For example, I found a lot in my research that horizontal inequalities or inequalities between groups are highly associated with violent conflict. So that's a finding about objective. But it's very interesting, therefore, it suggests people do perceive these, and do they? One of my colleagues did some research looking at perceptions of inequality by group and actualities, and it was very interesting, the findings, because they found that on economic inequalities, they were very inaccurate. They didn't perceive accurately. But on political inequalities, they were much more accurate. They knew, and I suppose it's obvious, you know, you can see who's president, but they knew that if their group had a member of their group was president, then they were quite right. They perceived that they were in a privileged position, and if their member didn't have any cabinet positions, they knew they were underprivileged. So they were quite accurate about the political inequalities. And then the really interesting finding was that their perceptions of their economic inequalities actually reflected their true perceptions of the political inequalities. In other words, if they saw their group was in power, they assumed that they would have had lots of redistribution and their group would also be in economic power, even if they weren't. So it was very interesting, even though I still stick by the fact that it is very important to recognize that objective inequalities, of course, are very unjust, so we should be against them, whatever the perceptions. No good us deciding to persuade everybody that we are in a just world when we're in an unjust world. We should go for justice. So objective inequalities are really what is really important to policymakers.
Farida, what can you say regarding this question about the kind of people you work with, these children? How do they feel about the situation of inequality they're obviously trapped in?
I would say that a big part of the situation, that because a lot of people see children on the street on a regular basis, somehow we stopped sympathizing with the case. And I think if you look at it at a more macro level, I see now that always the face of poverty, usually they use an African figure. And even this, and we see now a lot of people in hunger, and we stopped somehow really sympathizing and really calling for change. In my group specifically in Egypt, a lot of discussions with the girls, they would tell you that sometimes the reason why they do small criminal activities, for example, even just stealing something, it's because they want attention. They want people to see them. They want to be seen and they want to be heard. And usually, like, the worst form of torture is, what is it called? When you're imprisoned in a single cell. This is what drives a person actually crazy. So sometimes with groups who see that they're not being seen and they're not being heard, they start acting out differently to be seen. So they can be engaged in small, they can start knocking on the window, they're just trying to say, I'm here and I want attention and I want to be heard. So yes, thank you.
I want to be heard, which means that at some moment, at some level of inequalities, there are signals that are sent to governments, to responsibles, to the media, to different kinds of social actors that will have to produce a reaction because the signal is too loud in many ways. Is it the process through which inequalities are being sort of processed by societies and change over time? To formulate my question differently, are the situation we know now produced by policies that have been designed to fight against inequalities, but have produced new types of inequalities, so that there is always a dynamic. Inequalities should not be looked at as something static.
Right, yeah. I mean, absolutely, inequalities can change. And that's what gives me hope, actually. So, for example, we often think that inequality is getting worse and we're all doomed. But that's not the case at all. You know, many people live in parts of the world where inequality has fallen. In Latin America, one of the most deeply unequal places in the world, income inequality actually fell over the 2000s by 13% in the Gini coefficient. And that was partly one, in response to austerity, neoliberal economic restructuring, job losses, wage cuts, factory closures. People took to the streets, people took to protest against their unemployment, etc. But in that process, in that process of going onto the streets, people started questioning the status quo and they started sharing ideas. Indigenous groups started reaffirming their identities through fiestas, through parades, and trade unions recognized their collective strength. And that process, again, going back to what I was saying earlier, that iterative process of mobilizing, securing your government gain. For example, after the constitution-making processes in Brazil, Venezuela, Ecuador, people saw that they could have gains, they saw the government making headway, and then that encouraged them to mobilize more because they thought that change was possible. So absolutely, it's this iterative process. And I want to jump from Latin America to highlight an example closer to home. Because as we all know, the biggest inequalities in this world are not within a country, they're between countries, they're international. And I think a really exciting process of mobilization is right now in Switzerland. So in Switzerland, there is this huge civil society campaign pushing for corporate accountability. That is mandating that large Swiss companies should undertake to identify and reduce risks of human rights abuses in their supply chains. And if an abuse happens, like Rana Plaza, which killed 1,000 people, that Swiss company can be taken to court and found liable for those abuses. And this has happened as a result of civil society mobilization. Environmental groups, human rights groups, transparency groups, pushing and publicizing all these cases. Now 80% of the Swiss public support it. And seeing that survey, as you were saying earlier, seeing that survey with mass support, businesses have got scared. So Groupement d'Entreprises Multinationales in Switzerland, they came out in support of this law because they didn't want to be seen as like anti-human rights. So really by mobilizing, by publicizing, by changing the dynamics, I'm pretty hopeful.
Are you hopeful too?
So, want to be heard. I think people want to be heard. They want to be heard, but they want action. They don't just want to be heard. And I think you need politics in order to get that. And we can't overemphasize the importance of political exclusion. And in countries like our own, where on the whole you have political parties, and one time one political party will win, and another time another will win. So people, in a way, have shared political power. That's fine. You can have political mobilization, you can get change, you can get power. But we have other countries where politics goes according to the nature of your identity. And if you're in a minority identity now, you're going to be in a minority identity tomorrow and the next day and forever, so to speak. And those minorities, they may want to be heard, but they're not going to be heard because there's political dominance by one group. And it's in that sort of situation. And that was the situation, by the way, as an example, in Northern Ireland for many years in the 20th century, where the Protestants just had a permanent majority and consistently used it to discriminate against the Catholics. And so what did we get? We got violent reaction, and that's the way they could be heard, and were heard eventually, but it took 20, 30 years. So wanting to be heard is one thing, but what you want is action, and just being heard is not enough.
Farida, action, that can be the responsibility of government, but that can also be the responsibility of civil society, as we heard about this example in Switzerland, for example. You're taking part in these civil society actions. I guess situations are, again, very different from one country to another. In some places, we can rely on governments to design policies to fight inequalities. In others, it's rather more NGOs, for example. How do you, again, relying on your own experience, how do you see that question?
I think the role of NGOs is crucial, but I always say the NGO can never take the role to replace the government. So in the work that we're doing through the foundation that I'm representing, we're trying to create a model of intervention that could be later on adopted by the government and change policies, but it's unfair to expect from civil society organizations to take completely the role of the government and make this a complete change. they are an important component, but they're not the only one. Not only do I see that there is a responsibility from the governments of each country, but there's also an international responsibility that a lot of the time we tend to forget. There is an international responsibility to definitely not to allow inequalities to remain the way they are now, for people to be dying from hunger. There are some areas where I think the international community at large is also responsible for inequalities that happen in a lot of developing countries.
Now, I'd like to ask you about, you both, all of you were at some point talking about groups. I'd like to ask you about how things maybe have changed in societies where individualization has increased. What does it make to, what kind of consequences it has on the perception of inequality? I guess it's very different to perceive inequality as an individual or as a member of a larger group. And what are the political implications to that change, of that change? The other way around.
Oh yeah, whoops, sorry. You know, to be honest, I think they'd still hear me if I didn't have a microphone. But anyway, right. So the consequences of us becoming more individualized, that's often seen as like a bad thing, right? But I think as a feminist, many of us would emphasize the positives of no longer being dependent on a male breadwinner and women having their own financial autonomy to do whatever they like. And I think that example of women's economic independence from men is a nice way of us understanding inequalities, tapping into what Francis was saying earlier about the material drivers of inequalities and also the beliefs. So, for example, if we go back to 1950s in France, the USA, the UK, many women were housewives dependent on a man who could support them financially. And if women are discriminated against in the labor market, going back to Francis's point, then it can be difficult to leave an abusive marriage, to leave an unhappy marriage. So in that way, material inequalities can reproduce inequalities, but also our beliefs can compound them. If women never see any other single women being successful, being supported, then they may be too scared to leave, believing that they won't be able to look after their children by themselves. And so then we get into this chicken and egg problem. Because if women never see any other women by themselves as single, divorced women living successfully, they're reluctant to move out. And so no one ever sees anything. So how do we change it? There was this really fascinating experiment in Brazil. What they did is they looked at what had happened after people had got the television signal. And they found that after people started getting the television signal, the divorce rate went up. And what was happening was people were watching these soap operas and they were seeing these women leaving their abusive husbands and being fantastic and totally free and happy. And they thought, right, I could do it too. So just shifting people's beliefs about what was possible for people like them in their own communities, that can trigger individualization. So I just give those two examples of how material inequalities and also beliefs can reproduce inequalities or change them, not necessarily seeing individualization as a bad thing. But that's a good question.
Well, yes, I think we need to look at why individualization has happened, first of all. And if you look at it's to do with the industrial structure and so on. So in the 19th century, for example, in Europe, big working class, very homogeneous working class was created and was very underprivileged, obviously. And because they were homogeneous, were able to have a common identity, got together, formed trade unions, and eventually this paid off in terms of both political parties, which they supported, but also their own industrial action. And we found that the share of wages rose, and in fact, it was good for reducing inequality. But what we have now is a very different industrial structure in which there's a lot of division between people, the skills, a huge range of skills. There isn't so much a common working class. And in addition to that, we have in many countries, multiple ethnicities as we've had migration and so on. So again, this has broken up the sense of a common identity. Then plus we have the great pressure of neoliberal economics, which says, oh, trade unions are terrible, they're very destructive of of a free market. In fact, of course, they counter a free market. And the consequence is, if you look around many, many developed countries particularly, the share of trade unions has gone like this, and the share of wages has gone like this. And so they really are correlated. Now, in some of the newly industrializing countries, we have a much more 19th century Europe situation, Korea, where you do have a strong and relatively homogeneous working class, where you do have a very strong trade union movement, where you do have a fight against this rising share of profits. So, yeah, I think individualization is very pernicious, but you have to think, why has it happened, and what is the economic structure that lies behind it?
Farida?
Okay, can I rephrase the question? Just make sure that I understand it correctly.
Yes, sure.
So is it, how does individualization as opposed to communities kind of affect the idea of inequality?
And the perception of inequalities and the possibility to do something about it.
Okay, okay. If you don't mind, I will shift it more also to see in Egypt, because it's always a question whether the move to the cities and people being more individualized or more individualized, if this has affected the increase in the number of people on the street. So a lot of literature, actually, it suggests that actually this move to the cities and this being away from a community has actually caused that more kids have become on the street and more kids have become in danger. And one of the reasons is that before, the idea of a community, you always had an extended family, you had an uncle, you had the brother of the uncle, you had this the idea of the structure that would protect the child with the absence of protective measures or like child protection committees, so the child didn't end up having to run to the street. But now, with an increased individualized communities, an absence of extended families, the child resorts more to the street as opposed to having the community to depend on. I'm not sure if I'm really answering the question, but I'm kind of rephrasing it a bit to fit.
Yes, it does answer the question. It's very interesting way to put it through this example. So now that we try to think about inequalities, I think we should take into account the social cohesion, but more generally maybe the structure of society. We talked about it earlier, how it changed because it's affected by the changes in the economy, for example, specialization of tasks. And so I know you're not working on specifically on social cohesion, but I guess in your work you have an interest for what we can call the effects on society that inequalities have. How would you describe them? Can you sort of categorize different type of effects that interest you, that we can say inequalities are responsible for?
I think it would be difficult to generalize across the world, right? Because the way that people respond to inequalities could be in several ways. One, they might just accept it, as I was saying before, or they might react and push for accountability, push for redistribution, class war, or they might turn to the right. Yeah, we see that too, and we see that across Europe. So I'd say those three possibilities: do nothing, push for redistribution, or scapegoat whoever they think is the weaker group that they're encouraged to apply upon.
Francis?
Yeah, well, I think we need to sort of think a little bit about what social cohesion means. And looking at some point, I looked at literature on social cohesion. It's quite interesting. There's a sort of European view and there's an American view. And they're a bit different. The European view very much emphasizes inequalities, disparities, exclusion. And the American view emphasizes social connections and shared social norms and behavior. And putting these together with a colleague, we developed what we called a social cohesion triangle, with three points. And one is inequalities, one is trust, that represents the sort of American view, and one is identity, which is really put on top, that's our view. Because I think those three, between them, determine whether a society is cohesive. And inequality is absolutely key because there's a lot of work showing that the greater inequality there is, the less the trust. So you automatically reduce trust, more or less automatically, if you have a lot of inequality. If you have inequality between groups, you reduce general trust in the society. If you have a lot of inequality among individuals, it's what's sometimes called particularized trust. But trust goes down. And then identities. If you have a lot of group inequalities, then that strengthens identities, and people come together, maybe even form new identities in order to fight that group. They mobilize behind identities. So you have these three aspects of social cohesion, and inequality is absolutely key in those three, determining the whole sort of picture, and it determines the sort of American view about shared behavior and so on, but it also determines the inequalities, the European view. So it's very critical.
Would you say that these two different ways of seeing things and representing the system in America and in Europe still persist, or they tend to become closer over the years?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, I do think in America the increasing inequality is causing, obviously, people on the left at least, to be very concerned about the over-individualized situation, and very concerned, therefore, coming much closer to thinking about it in terms of inequality. And I think in Europe we would accept that shared views are important. The more so as in Europe, you know, there are so many divisions across religions and races and ethnicities, and we see the problem of shared views. One of the interesting things is that one or two societies have really made an effort to try and reduce the horizontal inequalities or group inequalities by all sorts of affirmative action and so on, and have done so very successfully. I mean, for example, in Malaysia, another example, Northern Ireland, where the inequalities between the groups has really come down, but they've done nothing on the sort of integration on the shared values sort of point, or on the social interactions. So the groups are much more equal, but they live in their little silos, and that's not social cohesion. So it's interesting. You need to work both on inequalities, but also on shared values.
If you, I'd like you to explain maybe something. I'm not sure I understood really the kind of relationship we can have between the three dimensions that you propose: inequalities, trust, and identity. Is it possible to make the assumption or the hypothesis that, for example, an increase in inequality will produce a decrease of trust and a crisis in political legitimacy, for example, things that we have observed over the years? I mean, there are less and less people that are voting, actually, for example, just to take one information. But these crises of legitimacies are everywhere, it seems now, in Europe, in many ways. The way politicians are being rejected very, very strongly. Has it something to do with the increase of inequality? And other question, does the rise of inequality produce a rise in identity politics?
Yes, I mean, I think the short answer is yes to both your questions. And I think we do see it in our societies. One of the interesting things is you can have inequality which is high for a certain number of years, but eventually, I mean, it doesn't immediately have any causes, but we have this persistent inequality in Europe accompanied by a type of economics which is shared by both the parties of the left and parties of the right, which tends to reduce the size of the state, to leave people on their own, and so on. And so these people have been neglected over a long time, and eventually something happens, something triggers, and there's a trigger. In the case of France, the increase in the carbon tax, the reduction or elimination of the wealth tax, very provocative. In Britain, our Brexit.
It's also an addition over the years. It's a very long process of.
Yes, so there's a long time, and in the US, a long time in which everybody was saying, you can't go on and on in which real wages is not increasing at all. And then something happens, a financial crisis, something happens, and then that triggers exactly what you say, a complete despair about politicians, a reduction in voting, and an identity politics in a very powerful way. Yeah, absolutely.
Farida, how would you look at this concept of social cohesion from your own point of observation and action?
I would focus on, because I agree there's a lot of definitions on social cohesion, so I would frame the question more, if you don't mind, is how does this inequality affect, translate in the society, and how do people react to all these inequalities and reduced social cohesion? And I would say usually it's either they mobilize, that's true, or a lot of the times they get suppressed, or it becomes accepted. And in Egypt, I would say the three happen parallel to one another. You've got, since the revolutions, you've got a lot of people mobilizing, but all these mobilizations get suppressed politically, and you've seen the level of imprisonment really on the rise. And then parallel to this, you see the majority of the population accepting. So it's really, so the level of inequality increases, the level of trust extremely decreases, but also the level of acceptance, surprisingly, things have been quite silent. I mean, it's, so yeah, so I'm not sure if I'm answering your question, but I'm trying to relate it to the context. Yeah.
Yes, you do. It means, Francis, it means that it can be possible to have at the same time less trust, but still nothing happening, and that's. And
then you have your square, your protests,
exactly.
And that triggers things.
Can you use it?
Then something triggers things, like a sort of series of protests, like in Egypt, and that triggers a great deal of political unrest. But it's not, I think it's not everybody who leads these unrests. It's probably quite a small minority, but you have this underlying dissatisfaction which supports them. And I think you can see that probably in Egypt, in France, and so on.
Well, the new thing maybe in France at the moment is the fact that this is launched not by organizations that existed before. Usually that was taken by trade unions or
Yes.
political parties, or and the new aspect of what is happening is the fact that it is made possible by the use of social networks and new media, for example, but not by classical organizations.
Yeah, it's really interesting that they can't find who to negotiate with.
Yeah. But this is, I think, also the interesting part of the recent mobilizations all across the world. People expect that there is a leader, but there's no leader, because usually people mobilize because of inequalities, but not necessarily they all share exactly the same inequality. So a lot of the times people call for rights, but for different groups, it's different rights, and it's still acceptable, but it becomes more difficult when it comes to, for example, I'm not an expert, but I understand that here now in Paris, they can't find someone to talk to, which makes it quite complicated. But it was also the case in Egypt during the revolution. We're not calling for one specific leader, or like people are just calling for different things, and all of them are of equal importance.
Well, it's not the effect of television that you were mentioning, but it's an effect of electronic communication on social relations in a society. Maybe one last question for all of you before the public can ask questions too. It has to do with the possibility to do comparison research between very different situations, and also the possibility to compare policies. How would you say interesting policies that were designed somewhere can be exported or imported in other situations, and are there more and more benchmark attitudes in a way? People are, I think, probably NGOs are very international now, and they can exchange experiences between very different contexts. Do you think one way to fight inequalities would be to be more profiting of these exchanges and doing more benchmark, doing more experience assessment, evaluation, and sharing all the results?
Yeah, I mean, I'm all about hope, right? So I think that if we look to Switzerland, if we look to Latin America, then we can be inspired by their example. So I think, one, yes, recognizing that government can be responsive in response to sustained mobilization, but near places like us. And that goes back to the work I was talking about in India, learning from parallel districts. But it's not enough just to think that we can export policies. So we can learn and we can be inspired, but policies, just transplanting them doesn't have the same effect. So for example, in Brazil, in the late 1980s, through the local government councils, they started what we call participatory budgeting, that poor people could have an input into how local government funds would be used. And because of the strength of civic associations, much of that expenditure was pro-poor, because they had strong autonomous organizations. And so the government thought, right, participatory budgeting, that seems nice. Let's have it across Brazil. But what they found is in northeast Brazil, where civil society is much less autonomous, much more dependent upon patrons, it doesn't have the same effects. And the elites, who thought that they knew best, who were dominating money, who had monopolist markets, they were dominating those processes. So we have to be very careful in thinking, oh, that policy works here, so it'll work in there. It's always mediated by the political context, by the material and the ideas.
Yes, I mean, I do agree with this.
I don't know why everyone always laughs after I talk.
I do agree that you can't just automatically take things from one situation to another. For example, in Bangladesh, the NGOs are amazingly efficient and have done fantastic jobs in education, in health, and so on and so forth. And then we have the Grameen Bank, which is very extensive, very effective. But then that was picked up and put throughout the world. And in many cases, it wasn't copied properly, but the context was different, and it didn't have anything like the beneficial effect. So that's really important. On the other hand, I think it is very valuable to go around the world and find out what policies have worked where, because we tend to be very pessimistic. You know, most of this conference has been very pessimistic. Inequality is increasing. There aren't many policies, blah, blah. And there are good policies. I know certainly there's a lot of very effective affirmative action policies around the world. There are places, particularly in Europe, where the tax system is working very well or pretty well, and you've got a lot of redistribution. So there are many good policies, and I think just telling people about them would be a very important thing. But the other thing is there are global policies. I mean, many of these inequalities have to be tackled globally, as people in Paris certainly know about the tax system and corporate responsibility and so on and so forth, but particularly taxing big companies and also preventing tax evasion. And that much we just can determine globally. We don't need to copy from one place to another.
Farida, I think you have some experience in for example, with SAMU Social, but it's a very different context in Egypt and in Paris.
It definitely is. It definitely is. I agree. It's really important to share knowledge and to share experiences. And there's so much to learn from one another. This is for sure. And there's so much to take. However, without political will, you cannot make a lot of change. And it's not only political will. I mean, by political will, it's also about the will of the people. Because people, a lot of the times, they choose. The reason why I'm saying a lot of the times, because this is not the case in all countries, but a lot of the times you choose your president, you choose the people you want to represent you. So there has to be a will to actually make this change. And this will means that it will affect each and every person. Because this means that a part of the taxes you pay will be distributed differently. So I mean, global politics is important. Each one of us to be aware of, to reach inequality, it means it could eventually affect you, the way you spend your money, the way you spend your taxes, but of course, sharing knowledge and experience in designing the model of intervention is important.
Thank you. Now it's time for your questions. Maybe we can take 2 or 3 before answering, and I guess a microphone can come to you. Yes.
Hi, I'm Zoe, King's College alumni and a current master's student at Sorbonne University. My question is for Francis. I wanted to come back to what you said about your example in Malaysia about the groups that are equal but there's no social cohesion. I was wondering if you could develop a bit on that, on how social cohesion could be enforced either by civic societies, which I don't know if they exist, or by the government in some way, just to enforce social cohesion between those equal groups. Thank you.
Merci. Awad Mohamed Larbi, ancien professeur ou bien professeur émérite, président d'Azilec. Farida disait que les enfants de la rue sont perçus par la société égyptienne comme criminels. En fait, les enfants de la rue sont le fruit.
S'il vous plaît, attendez 2 secondes parce que de façon à ce qu'elle puisse mettre son casque pour avoir la traduction. Si vous voulez bien reprendre votre question, monsieur, merci.
Donc, Awad Mohamed Larbi, professeur émérite, président d'Azilec. Farida disait que les enfants de la rue en Égypte sont considérés par la société comme criminels. En fait, ces enfants, ce ne sont pas eux les criminels, sont le fruit de crimes et le fruit de l'illicite et de l'immoral. Ce sont des enfants abandonnés. Bourguiba, autrefois, le président tunisien, a eu ce cas en Tunisie. Alors, il a essayé de le regrouper dans des villages. Alors, il les a appelés les villages des enfants de Bourguiba. Et ces villages sont devenus vraiment des élites. Au lieu d'être des enfants de la rue, sont devenus avec le sport, avec une bonne nourriture, avec l'éducation surtout, sont devenus des élites. Et ils étaient aussi le creuset pour le recrutement de la garde nationale et de la police nationale, et certaines même pour l'armée. Donc, il a inversé les vapeurs pour donner enfant de la rue est devenu un enfant de la cité. Je vous remercie.
Peut-être une 3e question pour
oui.
le moment. Et puis...
Alexandre Pache, Université de Cergy-Pontoise. Moi, j'ai envie de demander à nos amis France et Alice quel est leur regard sur le mouvement des Gilets jaunes, et est-ce qu'elles ne voient pas des différences importantes entre cette révolte française et latine et ce qui pourrait arriver en Angleterre ou dans les pays anglo-saxons? Moi, j'aurais bien aimé avoir leur regard sur les différences sur cette question-là, du lien social et du rapport avec les inégalités perçues, les différences qu'il y a entre le monde latin, le monde anglo-saxon, et à travers cet exemple des Gilets jaunes.
Alors, peut-être, Frances, pour la première question.
Right. Right, okay. Yes, how do you get true integration as opposed to you know, being equality, but the groups are not really integrated into a national project. And it's very difficult. I'm not going to be able to give you any simple answer, but I think we start in the schools, and we start with children going to the same schools. And that's just not the situation in the countries I'm talking about. You have Catholic schools, you have Protestant schools, you have Muslim schools, you have Chinese schools, Muslim Chinese and Malay Chinese in the case of Malaysia, Catholic Protestant in the case of Northern Ireland. And in each of the countries that are truly divided, one of the clear features is that children are going to different schools. So that's where I would start, and I would also start with the curriculum in the schools, that you have a common history, and you don't have just a history of one side. You don't have what, in a sense, in Britain is a sort of imperialistic history, where the children from the previous colonies have to learn the history of the Henry VIII's wives. You have to know how many wives Henry VIII had in order to become a British citizen. Can you imagine why one should need to know that piece of information instead of knowing what are the main religions, what are the national holidays of the Muslims, the Hindus, as well as the Christians, the Jews, and so on. So there's a huge agenda, and I think national holidays are an important place, also an important area. In many countries, you only have the national holidays of the dominant religion and not that of other religions, and so on and so forth. So it's respecting and including people across the country, across the society, in all your public events, but in particular in the schools.
Farida, if you want to.
I completely agree. Definitely they're not criminals. Definitely they're victims. Having said so, it's important to sometimes think of the policies you take to tackle such an issue. Tunis in general is known to be very active with policies, and they're quite modern. Having said so, in Egypt, for example, there were a lot of discussions a couple of years ago about whether it would be a solution for children on the street to be taken to like military camps and serve in the army. And of course, it's not a solution. It's not a solution. So it's really about developing protective measures that would allow the children to grow and not put them in a specific, like a military camp, and then expect them to be soldiers. So yes, but I completely agree. They're not criminals, and they definitely need to be protected and supported, for sure.
And now for the current news, a question about what is happening right now. Could that happen in Britain?
Yeah, so the similarities, and I thought that was a brilliant question, because I think we do see these similarities, right? That there's this opportunity cost, that when there's this sudden shock to people's incomes, whether it's through austerity in Latin America or a sudden rise in taxes, then people, organizing, mobilizing, taking to the streets, that's a hassle, there's lost income, it's a pain to do, it's cold, it's wet, so we don't ordinarily want to do it. But when the going gets really, really tough, well, we think we have to do it. We have to protect whatever we've got. So people then take to the streets, and then that forces an elite reaction. So, for example, in Colombia, when indigenous groups closed the Pan-American highway, they totally stopped the traffic, they totally stopped any kind of trade. It's not the elites necessarily thought that the indigenous groups were right, but they created such a ruckus that the hubris, the arrogance elites who thought that they knew best, they thought they had the understanding of how to govern Colombian society. I'm speaking metaphorically here, and you can infer from you will from that. That these arrogant elites, because of the crisis caused by mobilization, then they were prompted to take a response. So I think in both the case of Latin, and we can also think about what happened in Brazil in 2013. So in preparation, after the commodity boom ended in Latin America, when taxes went up, Infrastructure remained really bad. Transport was really bad in Rio de Janeiro, Belo Horizonte. People took to the streets and there were mass protests. And that stimulated an elite response. So it's not necessarily that the elites become more sympathetic or more supportive, but they realize that the status quo is untenable, and then they're forced to make various compromises. So you have those two effects. One is that the elites are forced to make compromises. Two is people recognize their strength in numbers. They recognize popular discontent, and that can embolden them to take further action. Now, for example, in France, people recognize 70 to 80% of people supporting them, and that's going to create a problem for Macron, right?
Can I come back to the comparison with Britain?
Sure.
And the Gilets? Man, I think there's a lot of similarity. I don't think that things happen in different ways, but we've taken people for granted for too long. And you see that in the Brexit vote. And I meant to say at the beginning, I forgot that I'm so pleased to be in Europe, and I'm so apologetic about my country. But you see it in the Brexit vote. And you also see, a few years back, we had riots, physical riots, which weren't about, well, they were about inequality, ultimately. They were triggered by someone being killed, but they were racial riots, really. So we have violence in UK, we have violence here, we take people for granted in UK, we take people for granted here. And in both cases, we shouldn't, but I think there is a lot of similarity across the two cases.
Alors, bonjour.
Oui.
Alors, moi, c'est Yaovi Abonkou, je suis doctorant en philosophie politique et éthique à la Sorbonne. Et je travaille sur les questions de justice globale, de solidarité internationale et d'innovation technologique. Je suis lauréat aussi de l'Institut de l'engagement qui est partenaire de l'FD. Et ma question est française. Ma question, quelle solution aujourd'hui à la surindividualisation résultante de l'accroissement des inégalités? Est-ce que vous proposez la solidarité? Et quand je parle de solidarité, je parle de solidarité internationale, solidarité sociale. Bien sûr, quand je parle de solidarité, entendu non pas comme générosité, mais plutôt comme prise de conscience des interdépendances et se baser sur une éthique des intérêts bien compris, un bon usage de notre intelligence pour rejoindre Kant dans Projet de paix perpétuelle. Ou alors, que pensez-vous, si oui, que pensez-vous de l'idée de Michael Sandel dans son œuvre contre la perfection, l'éthique à l'âge du génie génétique, qui trouve que la révolution transhumaniste mène vers la fin de la solidarité? Merci.
Vous avez un peu de temps pour préparer. Je crois que vous en aurez besoin. Une autre question? Oui, allez-y, monsieur.
I have two small questions. One is, what does the panel think about the emphasis that the international community has placed on poverty alleviation, not inequality? Now this inequality is being accepted, but for 20, 30, 40 years, they've been told that what really matters is poverty alleviation, even in an increasingly more unequal society. And in a book that Francis and I have edited, there are some very famous names among economists who say, well, poverty bothers me. Inequality, I don't care. You know? And this has become a sort of a general concept, and which has retarded the fight against inequality. Now, the second point is that the Alice Evans has mentioned Latin America, which I studied a lot, and this is absolutely true, that there were sort of popular movements, los indígenas, that have basically been carrying the movement towards equalization, and there have been major changes in political regimes, from right to left. Now, the question is, first of all, these movements are being reverted in Brazil and Argentina, and we have some explanation for that as well. Now, in Russia, there is a very high level of inequality, which is not correctly measured by whatever number we have. And so the point is that if you are in a state which is very repressive, I mean, people cannot organize because they send you the militia and then they put you in jail. And the last point is, if you go to India and if you go to Orissa, in Orissa there are the scheduled castes and scheduled tribes, and these people, they are no voice. So should the bourgeoisie, like Karl Marx said once in a while, long ago, go and organize them? Or should these people be self-organizing? That is the question.
Third one. Il y a des bras. On vous voit mal, donc. Oui, allez-y, si vous avez le micro.
Bonjour, Anne-Marie Dvorazek, je suis journaliste. Je tiens d'abord à féliciter Mademoiselle Alice, c'est une passionnée. On est tous enthousiasmés. Voilà, félicitations. Ma question dans le cadre de la perception des inégalités. Vous êtes trop optimiste pour moi, parce que à travers le monde, on voit des peuples se soulever et on voit aussi ces peuples être rembroués, renvoyés et souvent mis en prison. Alors, quel que soit, j'apprécie l'optimisme, mais est-ce qu'il ne faut pas un peu tempérer votre engagement, votre optimisme tout simplement, parce qu'on a d'autres exemples qui ne donnent pas les résultats que vous avez pu constater à travers le monde. Merci.
Si vous voulez.
Oui, merci. Well, solidarity, I mean, I think we are in a very depressing situation. Individually, we can act for solidarity. I think social media can be helpful in supporting solidarity. But probably the most depressing aspect of lack of solidarity is the way we're behaving towards the environment, which requires solidarity among countries today and also solidarity with future generations. And that's a type of inequality we haven't talked about. But it's probably the most important inequality at the moment, which is the likely inequality between what we are having as a society, everyone alive today, and the likely poverty of future generations because of our failure to take action. So I think there's a huge failure in solidarity, and if I knew the answer, that would be great. But there is one answer, of course. If only we could have our genetic breeding or whatever, to breed the altruistic gene in and the individualistic gene out, well, then maybe that something would happen. So that would be my answer. On poverty alleviation, Andrea, yeah, I think poverty alleviation was used. I mean, of course, we are against poverty, but I think it was used as the sort of flag because you could do it consistent with the structure of society and the way in which the economy was organized. Whereas once one begins to talk about inequality, one really has to think much more seriously about whether our present system is adequate. And so I think that's why people preferred, they now do talk about inequality, preferred to use poverty alleviation.
Yes, so you're totally right, yeah? Of course, inequalities are widespread across the world, and we're all deeply concerned about them. That's why we're here. So I entirely agree empirically with what you say, that when people rise up, there is horrific repression, inequalities are widespread. 100% agree. But I think there's the next question about what each of us can do and how we should respond to that. Because if I came here, and if I gave you a very depressing talk, you would leave this room despairing, low, unlikely to mobilize. Like, if you're pessimistic, you're not going to invest in any kind of campaign to try to get change. You're despondent, you don't mobilize, and we stay in that path-dependent chicken and egg loop. But perhaps if I highlight a few cases that we can learn from, I'd hope that people would leave this room thinking, maybe change is possible. So empirically, I agree with you, but strategically, I'm trying to mobilize you. Can I respond briefly to Andrea's question? Yeah, so that's a really excellent question. And I think, for me, so I think 2 points you highlighted are the international and then inequality or poverty reduction and how to engage. And for me, I think in terms of how we engage strategically, how we mobilize, it's by getting our own houses in order to tackle global inequalities. Because as we all know, global inequalities are the single biggest inequalities. So it's sorting out our carbon emissions. It's welcoming immigrants, enabling them to thrive in our communities, supporting corporate accountability. So France, as many of you will know, that as of 2018, 2018, you have a devoir de vigilance, whereby large companies are mandated to identify and reduce risks of human rights abuses in their supply chains. And if they fail to do so, if abuse happens, they can be taken to court. So it's tackling these international inequalities. And a way I like to think of it is internalizing international externalities, because so much of our behavior adversely affects people in other parts of the world. So rather than thinking, how can I help these people in India? It's about, what can I do to use our wealth and our advantage so we stop making it worse for everywhere else, recognizing that it is bad for many people in many parts of the world. So thank you both for those questions.
Hi.
Oui.
I keep thinking about Alice's views of the world, and it seems a little bit simplistic, because what is the best option for the elite after the masses mobilize? It's just to give what's just enough to let them stop. So probably we should also go out from here, say that we need better policies, better policymakers, because the masses are not just enough.
Could you elaborate a little bit your question? Asks
that
Alice.
The masses, they move, but then they get back just a little bit to be quiet again. And the world goes back to, doesn't change much.
Another question?
Oui, pardon.
Plenty of them.
Bonjour, je suis Audrey Fabrira en master de géographie à la Sorbonne. J'ai une question un peu théorique. Ce que j'ai compris, c'est que les gens arrivent à créer une identité commune. Il y a des minorités religieuses, des minorités ethniques qui se mettent ensemble pour avancer. Est-ce que la cohésion sociale sans inégalité, est-ce que le but, c'est d'arriver à une société où justement il n'y a plus de groupe et chaque individu individuellement est égal à l'autre, ou est-ce que le but, c'est d'arriver à une cohésion sociale où on garde ces groupes, mais qu'entre ces groupes, il y ait une égalité, et voilà.
Et une troisième.
Yeah.
Oui, allez-y.
Yeah. Hi, my name is Ellen. I work for Oxfam Germany. Thank you very much for all your inspiring contributions. One question I have on the mobilization, for example, with the Gilets jaunes today and the different inequalities that motivate action, where I see a difficulty in the post-protest period if there are so different inequalities that people want to address. And I think that's one thing that we haven't talked a lot about is the coalitions that we have to form in the long durée to bring about that change. And where I was wondering from your experience or your, how do you see that we really get these long-term broader coalitions so that it's not just one-time uprising, but really policy change in the long run? And another thing, but if I understood you right, it's experience that shapes perceptions. And isn't then the imperative for civil society as well as government, as well as science maybe, to allow people, and for all of us in the audience, by the way, to create spaces in which people have this experience of solidarity, of respect, and of dignity, and of accountability as something to build on in future interactions. And I think that sometimes we do not devote enough attention to this part of our work.
Can I take the question about change? Yeah, so I think this is so important, and we can see people rising up and just being smacked down. So look at the Arab Spring, for example. Across the Arab world, people rose up, and then, with the exception of perhaps Tunisia, we've only seen more repressive governance and backlash. That's absolutely right. But I think that's a short-termist view. So if we look at 1848, when the French removed their monarchy, what this inspired was a wave of democratic protests across Europe. People heard news from Paris and they thought, we too, Democrats can push for reform. And what happened? Just like the Arab Spring, these military, oligarchic monarchies repressed the people in Austria, what was then Germany, across Europe. So again, that change, that mobilization didn't lead to anything. But if we take a longer term view, if we look beyond that single year, if we look after 1848, 1860s, continuing reform in the late 1880s, then women getting the vote in the early 20th century. So, I mean, what I'm saying is that people mobilize, the elites give a little, and people continue to mobilize. It's always a long struggle, a conflictual process. So none of this happens overnight, right? That's all.
Right, I do agree with just what Alice just said, just to start with. I think that we're a bit depressed about what's happening, for example, in Europe at the moment, but when you think of the progress compared with 200 years ago, it's immense. And what we take for granted in terms of access to health, access to education, access to some benefits if you're not in work, and so on and so forth. These are achievements as a result of long-term mobilization through political action, and they shouldn't be taken for granted, but political action continues, and I think we have made huge progress, so it's not all thrown back. On the question of social cohesion, is it just a matter of group equality? Have we got it then? Well, what I was arguing was that it's not only a matter of group equality, you need respect and good relations between the groups. And that there is a big sort of divisional opinion here. Do you want a homogeneous society in which everybody has just one single identity? Are you trying to eliminate difference? And personally, I'm pluralist. I'm not in favor of that. I feel that groups should have the right to have distinct identities, but they should respect each other. They should have good relations among each other, with each other. They should know each other. They should be friends, or so on and so forth. And that in addition to that, they should have a national identity. So, I mean, one's aiming for a situation in which people have some local identity. I'm Jewish. I have a Jewish identity, but I'm also British and also, at the moment, European. And all those identities matter. But you want a situation in which people do have a national identity as well as a local identity. That's my ideal, but I know I can't lay it down for everybody. Many countries in Europe are trying to get a sort of single identity and they would like to eliminate the differences. And they do so in a very hegemonic way, in the sense that what they're really trying to do is trying to impose the identity of the majority group on everybody. And if they did it in a different sort of way, in which people came together and formed some sort of cohesive identity, bringing everyone in, that would be different. But the way they're doing it is very unfortunate. And in my view, you might eliminate economic inequalities, but you would still have cultural inequalities. So you wouldn't really have solved the problem.
Okay, maybe we can take a last round of 3 questions from different areas of the room.
Oui.
Voilà, je vous vois.
Bonjour, moi je m'appelle Salimata Sissoko et je suis présidente d'une association Maman sans frontières. Donc c'est une association pour aider les femmes et les jeunes contre l'illettrisme et le numérique qui sont en retard par rapport au numérique. Je vous pose une petite question. Est-ce qu'on ne va pas assister à une autre forme d'inégalité avec l'évolution du numérique? Voilà. Donc, voilà. Et je souhaiterais quand même que l'année prochaine, notre association souhaiterait que l'année prochaine, que la salle soit remplie des gens qui sont plus concernés par l'inégalité. Parce que quand on regarde dans cette salle, les gens qui sont plus concernés par l'inégalité ne sont pas là parce qu'ils n'ont pas accès au numérique. Voilà.
Oui, monsieur.
Bonjour. Merci beaucoup pour ces interventions très très intéressantes. Faisant le constat du délitement du lien social en France, beaucoup de gens sont nostalgiques du service militaire qui permettait, je suis trop jeune pour l'avoir vécu, mais paraît-on, de brasser des gens venant de situations géographiques et par définition de milieux sociaux différents. Je crois qu'Emmanuel Macron avait prévu initialement dans son programme un service civique qui a été un peu, je crois, mis au rabais, mais cette idée revient aujourd'hui. Est-ce que vous pensez que service civique obligatoire peut être une idée pertinente pour recréer de la cohésion sociale?
Et une dernière question. Oui.
Oui, bonsoir. Je m'appelle Moustapha Mohamed, je suis doctorant à l'Université Paris-Dauphine. Moi, ma question, ça concerne plutôt les inégalités intra-ménages. Parce que quand on regarde dans le pays en développement, à l'intérieur même des ménages, tu as des inégalités envers les enfants adoptifs ou envers les filles, notamment dans l'accès à l'éducation et tout. Et donc, que pensez-vous de ce type d'inégalités et quel impact pourrait avoir ce type d'inégalités sur le lien social ou encore la cohésion? Merci.
Yeah.
Military service.
Sure.
Thank you. Sorry, did that sound too
No,
clean
it's
about
okay.
military service? Okay. I think that's a really great point. How can we get people to come together across diversity? And for me, I wonder if military or civic service might be a bit late in the day. What about people where they're younger? And for me, that's why I would suggest banning all private schools so that all people go to the same schools and associate together and learn from people from the banlieue or whatever. So I think get it started earlier and build social cohesion from the very beginning. But I like your points. Thank you.
Yeah, I think the national service idea, in fact, is being tried out in a few countries. And a colleague of mine is trying to do a sort of scientific assessment as to whether it's really changing attitudes by looking at taking a sample of attitudes before people join the service and then attitudes after they finish. And it's going to be very interesting to find out what the results are and whether it does have a cohesive effect. But I think it might well do, and I think it's a very interesting thing to do and probably very good for young people to do something for society at that age, so it might be a very good thing to do. On the household, it's a hugely important inequality between girls and boys in the household. And of course, in some Asian countries, it's even, pre-birth that they're discriminated against girls, and also in their first year of life, so that the whole ratio of girls to boys gets skewed in some of those countries. And it's obviously very unjust, it's very bad in that sense, morally bad, morally unacceptable. But in addition to that, it has huge effects on everything else, because girls' education, we know, is the most important element in the health of the household. And does it affect social cohesion as a whole? I'm not so sure, but I think it does affect domestic violence, and you find that the more educated and the more equal women are with men, that domestic violence is less. So it's hugely important. It may not affect social cohesion as a whole.
Farida?
Back to the question of civic service and education. I agree 100% education is key. And I agree 100% about banning private schools and yeah. Having said so, it's quite important, I think, when we look at the whole educational system and how we wanted to include more nationalities and cultures, that this also requires changing the entire system. Because the current system, the way it is, it doesn't really include all cultures. So it's really important when we talk about, like, we want them to have a specific nationality and to be this national perspective. It's really sometimes how this system kind of, for a lot of communities, eradicates their culture. So it's difficult to be integrated this way. So it's really, I don't know, we need to find a balance somehow, I think, in the middle. About household, I agree, I totally agree that a lot of the times inequalities within the household. But also sometimes I feel a lot of the times we tend to make judgments or assumptions about inequalities based on, again, our own culture. A lot of the times, for example, I see a lot of debates about people who are veiled or who wear very conservative clothes. A lot of people see them that they're forced to do it, or this is a form of inequality because they don't have the right to wear whatever they want, when it's not the case. So a lot of the times, I think we have to question over and over, what do we mean by inequality, and where is the line that we have to draw between inequality and cultural practices, and what do we accept in these cultural practices and what we don't? Thank you.
And there was also maybe, I don't know, you have something to say about the digital inequality
Well, it is bad now. I think it will be overcome. Children are so brilliant at picking up digitization, and I think as soon as the technology spreads, and it's getting cheaper and cheaper, I think it's not one of the inequalities that worries me most. I have a feeling it's going to be overcome pretty quickly.
Well, thank you very much to all of you, the three of you. And thank you for your attention.